Today we live in an age of autonomy. And even in the medical world, we talk about patients' autonomy. We enjoy personal freedoms, rights, liberties, maybe a little less so here in Israel than back in the United States, but well, we enjoy our own personal space, although that too sometimes is cultural. You visit a different country and they define personal space a little bit differently. You don't necessarily have your Dalit Amos. But we don't like people to tell us what to do or how to think or what to think. Some of us may have issues with authority. Certainly, some of my kids do. And at first glance, our Torah appears to be authoritarian. It's a book of rules. Thou shalt not, do this, don't do that. L'chora, it would seem somewhat restrictive, yet we're all familiar with the Mishnah in Avos, which says that there is no Bein Chorin, there's no one as free as he who is engaged in the study of Torah. So, no one as free. I mean, is the Torah about freedom? L'chora, it's about a submission to authority, Hashem's authority. And as I said, this is something that many struggle with, and I think modern man struggles with this. Maybe you could argue that the election of certain presidents in certain places might be a rejection of the establishment, right? Although typically people who become president are, if they weren't already, very quickly become part of the establishment. But this is something that modern man struggles with, and it's something that I certainly have struggled with. And so this morning I'd like to explore together with you a famous Gemara in Shabbos, a famous passage which describes the scene at Har Sinai, and I think has a very important message for us today. So if you take a look here at source number 1, the Torah in Shmos Perek Yutes describes the scene at Sinai. Vayi bayom hashlishi b'yot haboker. Right, we mentioned this pasuk already in the first year this morning. Vayi kolot uvrakim vanan kaved al har v'kol shofar chazak meod vayecherad kol ha'am asher b'machaneh. Thunder and lightning and the smoke and the fire and the cloud and the sound of the shofar, and the people were frightened. And then the next pasuk, Vayotze Moshe ta'am likrat Elokim, right? Based on the measures that we saw in the first year, he had to wake them up and take them because they had overslept. Vayityatzvu b'tachtit hahar, and they stood literally at the foot of the mountain. They stood at the foot of the mountain. But in a number of places, Chazal read Vayityatzvu b'tachtit hahar to mean they stood underneath the mountain, and that is a famous Gemara which appears in. I'm sorry. Oh, please. It appears in Gemara Shabbos here in source number 2. There's a parallel passage in Maseches Avodah Zarah. Rashi quotes this famous Medrash or Agada in his Peirush al HaTorah there to Pasuk Yud Zayin. And so take a look here at source number 2. This is a Gemara that we're all familiar with. Vayityatzvu b'tachtit hahar. They stood at the foot of the mountain, or as the Gemara wants to read into the pasuk, underneath b'tachtit hahar, underneath the mountain. Amar Rav Avdimi bar Chama bar Chasim Elamed shekafa Kadosh Baruch Hu alehem et hahar kigigit. This teaches that Hashem held the mountain over them like a barrel, a gigit. Amar lahem, and he told them, if you accept the Torah, good. V'im lav, but if not, sham tehei kvuratchem. Here will be your graves, your burial place, your kvuros. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov mikan modar rabalo raita. Wow, suggesting that we were forced into this covenant would be a great protest against the Torah, meaning at Har Sinai, we entered into this covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if we did so against our will, as the Gemara suggests, that would seem to undermine the whole concept of Kabbalas HaTorah and be a great protest. That's what it means. Moda Rabba Lo Raisa, a great protest against Torah, meaning... I'm sorry? Right, we accepted it under duress, against our will. This would undermine the whole idea of entering into a covenant with a Kadosh Baruch Hu. If you're entered into a covenant, or you enter into a covenant against your will, right? You enter a deal against your will, that deal's not valid. Okay? So Amar Rava says, no, don't worry about it. Afa pichein, hadur kiblu bi Achashverosh. The generation in the days of Achashverosh made a renewed acceptance, or accepted it once again. Right? Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim. The pasuk describes how the Jewish people accepted upon themselves and for future generations the mitzvah of Purim, or the holiday of Purim. The holiday of Purim and those mitzvos that Mordechai and Esther and Mordechai Ubeis Dino institute. Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim. But for Chazal, kimu masha kiblu kvar. They upheld what they had already accepted. In other words, they made a renewed acceptance. So, lest you think that somehow suggesting that the Jewish people were forced under duress into this covenant with the Kadosh Baruch Hu at Har Sinai, no, don't worry about it. Centuries and centuries later, they renewed their acceptance of the Torah. Okay, now whatever that means, on that point, we'll have to save for a discussion another time. Hopefully there'll be another time. But here, I'd like to focus together with you on the first part of the Gemara. And anyone bothered by this? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu held the mountain over our heads and forced us to accept the Torah? Otherwise, he is going to drop it on us? If not, Sham Teikvu Raschem. I mean, anyone bothered by this imagery? I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. Is that in 1, 2, or 3?
This goes against the metric that says that Baruch Hu went to all the other nations of the world. They all refused it, and Faisal said,
not only does this seem to go against statements in the Medrash, in Chazal, but this seems to go against psukim in the Torah, Pshuto Shel Mikra. In other words, here we have this description of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a tyrant forcing us to accept the Torah, otherwise he's going to drop the mountain on our heads. And that would seem to contradict what the Torah itself says about what happened at Matan Torah. The pasuk in Shmos Yutes, Vayanu kol ha'am yachdav, the entire nation answered together, Vayomru, and said, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh, whatever Hashem has said, we will do. And then in Perek Chof Dalid, Vayomru kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. Well, okay, but na'aseh v'nishma, where they're saying we're going to do even before we know, you're saying that is a reaction to the mountain above their heads. Okay, maybe. I hear the suggestion. But l'chora, from the psukim in the Torah, from the psukim themselves, l'fi pshuto shel mikra, is there any suggestion of any coercion? Any religious coercion? Right? When it comes to Kabbalah Satorah. When it comes to where is the religious coercion when it comes to Kabbalah Satorah? A simple reading is that the Jewish people receive the Torah. They say Na'aseh v'nishma. Right. But I think already you're reading into it. You're giving your own perush on it. You're saying, well, because they were starving and they were wandering in a wilderness, so they had no choice, so they were desperate. So, okay, that's also called coercion. If you take advantage of a person who's in a desperate situation, you prey on someone who's in a desperate situation, you can convince them to do things that are against their will. Otherwise, but yes, I'm saying that's your perush. Again, according to just a simple reading of the text, is there any suggestion of coercion by Matan Torah? I would think a simple reading is just the opposite. Na'aseh v'nishma sounds like they're willing to accept the Torah even before they know what they're getting themselves into. Right? That's the whole idea. It's almost like, imagine if a parent says, "Oh, honey, I need you to sign this for me." Are you going to say, first, 1 second, I want to look it over with a fine-tooth comb. I want to send it to my attorney, have him first review it. No, your parent asks you to sign something, you're going to sign it. Because implicit in the relationship is trust. Every relationship is built on trust, especially if it's an intimate relationship. So Nasa v'nishma, again, now maybe I'm reading into it, but Nasa v'nishma is built on that trust. Okay, yes, Mr. Krah.
That there's state that has implications for generation. There's the punishment of a birth. There's all these things, and we tend to reject. Jesus rejects original sin that befalls everybody else, but the punishment does befall all these generations. So the question is, you say not sevenishma or Har Sinai, what is the implication for future generations?
Good. And we'll come back to that question in a moment. Good. So, yeah, but okay, but it's a valid question. We're going to come back to that question in a few moments. Mark, you mentioned that this would seem to contradict other midrashim and statements of Chazal and Safrut Chazal and rabbinic literature about how Hashem went around to all the nations and asked them if they'd want to receive the Torah, and they said, "Well, what's in it? Don't steal, forget about it, right? Don't kill. We'd love to kill." Okay, until he came to the Jewish people who said Na'aseh v'nishma. Okay, so what you find is you have many contradictions in rabbinic literature, many sources, many passages which present a very different view of Matan Torah, not one of religious coercion, but just the opposite. In fact, on the very same page of Gemara, the very same Amud, on Daf Peiches, the Gemara presents a very different description of what took place at Har Sinai, here in source number 3, and the Gemara emphasizes Nasa v'nishma. Darash Rabbi Simai, b'shashik dimu Yisrael Nasa l'nishma. At the time when the Jewish people, they prefaced the Nasa with the Nishma, or prefaced the Nishma with the Nasa. They said, first we're going to do, and then we're going to listen. Ba'u shishim ribo shel malachei asharet. 600,000 ministering angels came down, called Echad ve'Echad miYisrael, kishu lo shnei ketarim, and they gave every Jew at Har Sinai 2 crowns. That's why it's very cute. If you notice, your grandkids sometimes will come home before Shavuos from Gan with a paper crown with 2 crowns on it. Right? It's based on this passage here. One for Naaseh and one for Nishma. The Kevan shechatu Yisrael. But when the Jewish people sinned by the Chet HaEgel, Yadu 120 ribo malchei Chabala upirkum. Then, now this time, what is it, 1.2 million, I guess? 120 ribo, right? 1.2 million. Because 600,000 each gave them 2. So now you need 1.2 million to take but each angel this time is only taking 1, right? Angels of destruction, and they remove the crowns, following the Chet HaEgel. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Bisha shekdimu Yisrael nasa l'nishma yatzta bat kol v'amra lahen mi gila lebanai zeh shemalachei hasharet mishtamshim bo. At the time when the Jewish people said Naaseh before the Nishma, the ministering angels, or actually it's a Baskol, the Baskol came out, and the Baskol, the heavenly voice, said and asked, who revealed to my children this secret, this raz, this secret that only the ministering angels know about? That you got to say the Naaseh before the Nishma. Okay? So here, on the very same Amud, a few lines down in the Gemara emphasizes the Naaseh v'nishma and presents a very different picture of the scene at Sinai, one of bechira, of choice, right? Not of religious coercion or being threatened and entering into the covenant under duress. And in fact, we have many statements in the Talmudic and Midrashic literature which seem to contradict this image of coercion. The Mechilta describes how the Jewish people accepted the Torah b'simcha, with joy, and describes Hashem not as a tyrant ready to strike and drop a mountain upon our heads, but rather a zakein malei rachamim, an old man full of mercy. Zakein malei rachamim, like a grandfatherly figure, if you will. Other midrashim, as we'll see, describe Har Sinai like the wedding between God and the Jewish people. If you take a look at source number 3, source number 4. Source number 4. The Mechilta, here in source number 4, right? Based on the pasuk, how Moshe takes the Jewish people. We saw the Midrash in Shir Hashirim Rabbah this morning about how Moshe had to wake them up. When the Torah says he brought them to Sinai, for the Midrash there, he had to wake them up because they overslept. But here, he brought them like what? Like you bring a chassan and kala together. Like you walk down the aisle with your parents or your groomsmen or your shoshvinim. And he's described as bringing them. He's bringing them. And Hashem, it says Hashem mi Sinai ba. So the Medrash says it really should have said Hashem lis Sinai ba, right? So what does it mean Hashem mi Sinai ba? It sounds like Hashem came from Sinai. It should have said Hashem lis Sinai ba. Hashem comes to Sinai. What does it mean Hashem came from Sinai? L'kabel et Yisrael kechatan ze shehu yotze likrat kala. Hashem was like a chassan who steps towards his bride to greet his bride. And there is a minhag based on this medrash that the chassan who walks down first to the chuppah and they're singing, mi adir and this and that and whatever. So then he walks, as the kala is coming, he walks towards her based on this. And many of the minhagim that we have at the chuppah harken back to our experience at Har Sinai. You ever see parents walking their kids down, holding on to big Havdalah candles in these glasses, and they get to the chuppah, and they don't know where to put them? They don't want to set the chuppah on fire, and sometimes the caterer goes and takes them from the people, but otherwise I see parents are looking around, not knowing where do I put these things, okay? That is supposed to be evocative of the lapidei eish, the fire at Har Sinai, the torches that are described as being at Har Sinai. And so many of the customs that we observe, okay? And there are more midrashim here. If you look at source number 5, Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, Kfar al-Chatan mevakesh lavie et hakala lachnis lachupa kidei litain lachem et haTorah. Ba'asha shenamar v'yotzei Moshe ta'am. So again, Moshe, he's like the groomsman bringing the bride, bringing Knesset Yisrael. V'af HaKadosh Baruch Hu yatzah likratan. And so too HaKadosh Baruch Hu went to meet them. Kichatani yotzei likrat kala, like a chassan comes to greet his bride. Very similar to what we saw in the Mechilta. And then here, the Medrash Tanchuma, Vayitain el Moshe ki kalato, or ki chalato ledaberito. So the Medrash says, don't read ki chalato when Hashem finished speaking to him, but read ki kalato, his bride. Okay? All these midrashim that talk about this wedding that took place at Har Sinai, and you're all familiar with these concepts and Shir Hashirim, etc. The marriage between God and the Jewish people which took place at Har Sinai. So, according to this reading, Har Sinai above our heads is not this threatening image, but it becomes a chuppah. Vayityatzu b'tachtit har, standing under Har Sinai, is not this expression of coercion, of duress, of being threatened, but rather it's a chuppah above our heads, according to this reading. And there's a beautiful mechilta here in source number 4. It's that second section here. The Torah describes how vayityatzu b'tachtit har, we gathered underneath the mountain or at the foot of the mountain. Yityatzvu, we appeared. But the Medrash says nitzakafu, we huddled together. Why do we need to huddle together? Because the scene was indeed frightening. The thunder, the lightning, the smoke, the fire, the earthquaking, the kol hashofar, that's holech v'chazek, right? The sound of the shofar, which got louder and louder. It was frightening. Milamed sheYisrael mityarin, mipnei hazikin, mipnei hazavaot, mipnei ha'aramim, mipnei abrakim habayim. The Jewish people were afraid because of the sounds and the lights and the scenes and the earthquaking and the thunder and lightning. And so they huddled together. B'tachtit hahar. What does it mean underneath the mountain? Melamed shenitlash hahar mimkomo v'kirvu v'amdu tachat hahar. The mountain above their heads is a symbol of protection. They huddled and gathered underneath the mountain and took shelter underneath the mountain, like a bird finds shelter in the rock. And this is based on a pasuk that the Medrash cites. V'tikruvun v'tamdun tachat har. The Medrash continues and brings a pasuk from Shir Hashim, Yonati b'chadvei hasela. My dove in the clefts of the rock. Like a bird who takes protection inside a little crevice of a rock, a little opening in the clefts of the rock, so too the Jewish people found protection and shelter underneath Har Sinai. So here in this Medrash, Har Sinai over our heads is not this threatening image, but rather we find protection in Har Sinai. Like a dove finds protection in the clefts of the rock. We find refuge there, almost maybe in a motherly way. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you could read this Medrash to suggest that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is protecting us with Har Sinai. Yes?
Were they kind of they were told that they should even approach?
No, they didn't approach. You're right. They didn't approach.
Well, if you approach the
But
shadow underneath.
The shadow's not the mountain. They weren't allowed to touch the mountain. They weren't allowed to approach, but it's held above them. Yeah. Har Sinai, as the Medrash says, wasn't the biggest of mountains, but it was a mountain, right? There's a lot of perushim on that Medrash. Like, why did Hashem choose Har Sinai? Well, it wasn't the biggest mountain, because someone who is full of themselves, right? A Baal Gaiva can't exist with Torah. Torah can't exist with the Baal Gaiva. So it teaches humility, anova. But as the Sfas Emes points out, but it's still a mountain. A Jew still has to have a little backbone. A little pride is healthy. It's still a mountain. No, they didn't touch the mountain. The mountain is held above them. That's not a contradiction. Again, but it's a medrash. So we have to give Chachamim, we have to give Chazal a little midrashic license anyway. Yes? I'm sorry? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry, what was that last point? It's stronger than a medrash. Okay. Fine. Okay. I hear the question. I'd like to ask a slightly different question, or focus on these midrashim or these statements that l'chora appear to contradict one another. Right? In other words, we have the Gemara that we began with, which suggests that Hashem is holding Har Sinai above our heads and saying, if you accept the Torah, good. If not, I'm going to drop it on you. Sham tekvuraschem, here will be your graves. And then other midrashim say, no, the mountain above our heads is the chuppah between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people. It's this marriage. It's this love. It's that intimacy, right? That wedding that is Har Sinai. Har Sinai is the wedding. It's a symbol of protection. We found shelter underneath the mountain. So which one is it? Which one is it? I'll take questions in a moment. Which one is it? So I think these various midrashim convey and express two different elements in our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Two different elements. And they express perhaps a dialectic or a tension that's inherent in every relationship. In every relationship, you have choice, you have consent, hopefully communication, and hopefully intimacy and love. Right? And that, of course, is Har Sinai as the chuppah, right? Or Har Sinai as this place of shelter and refuge. But there's also in every relationship expectations. There's commitment, obligations, responsibilities. You have to give of yourself, as any married individual knows. Okay? In fact, many point out that the word for love in Hebrew, ahava, comes from hav, which means to give. And so every relationship, every healthy relationship, let's say, has both of these elements. Again, there's that love, that intimacy, that communication. Har Sinai is the chuppah, but also, that threatening image, which expresses, right, it doesn't have to be a threat, but there are expectations, that the things you have to do, there's obligations. And I think that is difficult for people today when people just want the love, they just want the intimacy. They're not necessarily willing to commit to all the obligations that come with that. And maybe that's why so many relationships don't work out. Chazal tell us, Kol omer davar b'shem omro mevi gula le'olam. All who say something in the name of the one who says it, they bring redemption to the world. So I once heard Oprah Winfrey say that, the Rebbitzin. I once heard Oprah Winfrey say that people want to get married, but not everyone wants to stay married. People want to get married. From the time a young girl is a child, she's thinking about her white wedding dress and what her chuppah is going to look like and the knight in shining armor that's going to come in on a white horse. Okay, boys are thinking about, they're playing with toy soldiers or G.I. Joes or something. They're thinking about sports maybe. But people today, they just want the love, the intimacy without the expectations or with the obligations. And I think that's why in the Jewish world today, many want to focus on just, give me the nice ideas, tikkun olam. You see this a lot in the Reform and Conservative world. What's incredible is how influential Hasidic thought has become in the Reform and Conservative world. I think a lot of it has to do with Shlomo Carlebach and Zalman Schachter Shalomi and the renewal movement who brought Hasidic literature to the, let's say, non-Orthodox world. Okay? And you have these chaburot and all these shuls where they're singing and they're dancing and they're learning Hasidic texts. They're learning the Mea Shiloach and they're learning the Eish Kodesh. And they're focusing more on the Ahava, which is a beautiful thing, the Yira less so. Right? They just want the good stuff. They want the love, the intimacy. They want Har Sinai as the chuppah over their head. They're not ready yet for Har Sinai being held over their heads like a barrel. Okay, but both elements are necessary for any relationship. And one of the themes, of course, in the thought of Rav Soloveitchik is that halacha requires man to surrender at times. To surrender. What does it mean to surrender? All right? It means that I might want to do something, but the halacha requires me to do something else. It's not just about the love and the relationship, but there are also rules. There are also gvulot and boundaries. The halacha tells me that I have to submit myself to Hashem's will. I might want to do something. I want to, go to the ball game on Shabbos, whatever. The halacha says, no, I have to submit my will to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will. Or as the Mishnah in Avos says, right, be mevatel my will, nullify my will before his will and make his will into my will. Ultimately, the goal is that his will becomes my will, that we are aligned. Right? But that's difficult. And we speak of Ol Malchus Shamayim and Ol Mitzvos. It's an Ol, right? It's a yoke. It's a burden. What do we call serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Avodas Hashem. It's an avoda. The other night I was taking my 14-year-old to Meyer. He said, no, but I don't want to go. I'm tired. It's called avoda. Tefillah is called avoda shebelev, but it's an avoda. It's work. You have to do it. You have to commit, right? And that's difficult. That's difficult. But the truth is, when you are madly in love with someone, you are willing to surrender. And it doesn't mean that you're, a doormat to be trampled upon or taken advantage of. But what it means is that you want to give to that person. And I think that now we can maybe understand Sham Tehei Kivuraschem. Right? The Gemara that we began with, where Hashem holds Har Sinai over our heads like a barrel, and he says, accept the Torah, good. If not, here will be your graves. Sham Tehei Kivuraschem. What does it mean? What's this imagery of a graveyard? What's a graveyard? Graveyard is a monument to something that once was, but there's no longer any life there. And I think maybe what the Gemara is saying is, if you don't convey this nuanced understanding of the relationship, this complex relationship, this duality, if you don't teach commitment along with the love and the intimacy, so then you won't have Jewish continuity. If you just focus on Har Sinai as the chuppah, if it's the chuppah alone, beautiful, but it's not going to last. Sham tehei kuburaschem. You have to have, along with that love and intimacy, you also have to have the tachlis, as Mark said. You have to have the commitment, the obligations along with it, that it's not meant to always be so easy. And that's difficult. But if you fail to convey that to the next generation, then you won't have a living, breathing Judaism. Sham tehei kiburaschem. A living, breathing, healthy Judaism requires an understanding of this nuanced, complex relationship, of this duality, these two elements. And I think if we appreciate this, it helps make our relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu and His Holy Torah one that is genuine, one that is real, honest, sincere, and one that has depth to it, one that is imbued with meaning, purpose, richness, and fullness.